We are likely over consuming the world's most profitable nutrient and it's wrecking our waistlines. Fat, carbs and protein. You'll have heard of these three macronutrients before. But which is truly critical to your diet? Answer: all of them. Together, they're essential for keeping your body functioning. They give you energy and make sure all your cells are working properly. However, you'd be forgiven for thinking that protein is more essential than the others and that you're not getting enough of it. After all, why else would food companies have quadrupled the amount of high protein products available worldwide over the past decade, with the investment in such produce expected to rise almost 8% every year until at least 2028? What could the motive be for squeezing protein into everything from snack bars, breakfast cereals and drinks to pasta, yogurts and much more? Quite simply, protein sells. The food industry's high protein drive is sadly not all part of a public health plan to fix a hidden diet deficiencies in society. In fact, while many of us, including half of Americans, are aiming to increase our daily protein intake, most of us are already eating too much of it. How much you really need? Protein is, of course, incredibly important to our bodies. Made up of long chains of molecules known as amino acids, it is protein's job to repair cells in our bodies, particularly after exercising. Our muscles are rapidly turning over tissue. Every 60 days, all the proteins in our muscle are broken down and rebuilt, says Graham Close, professor of human physiology at Liverpool John Moores University. Protein is important in our immune cells, skin, biological enzymes, a huge number of processes. If we are not consuming enough, we can become deficient in any of these areas. Found in high quantities in foods like cheese, fish, meat, eggs, beans and legumes, the World Health Organization recommends healthy adults eat 0.8 grams of protein per kg, 0.1 ounce per ounce of their body weight every day. That means a person weighing 80 kilograms needs about 64 grams of protein a day, about 2 chicken breasts. However, you're unlikely to only eat 2 chicken breasts in a day. Protein can also be found in smaller quantities in the likes of pasta, roughly 3 grams per serving, milk 8 grams per cup, and peas 8 grams per cup, all of which adds up. Considering this, it's little wonder men and women are eating, on average, 81 grams of protein per day. For most people, this is at least 20% beyond recommendations. But it's worth noting there are some groups that will require more protein than others. For instance, it's recommended malnourished patients eat between 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilograms per day. Similarly, those aged over 65 also need to increase their intake to between 1.2 and 2 grams per kilograms of weight per day to help maintain all important muscle. It's inevitable that we start to lose muscle as we get older, and this can lead to reduced mobility, strength, independence, and quality of life, says Dr. Oliver Wittard, reader of Exercise Metabolism and Nutrition at King's College London. When it comes to how much protein we need, context is key. But what if you regularly exercise or are even a professional athlete? Surely you've got good reason to reach for a supplement. While athletes are often advised to have high protein diets, this often just means eating more foods overall, not solely protein drinks. Athletes generally perform a lot of physical activity, which means they also need to consume a lot of food to ensure they stay in energy balance, says Luc van Loon, professor of physiology of exercise and nutrition at Maastricht University Medical Center in the Netherlands. Therefore, most already consume a lot of protein in their diet, which means that they generally don't need to add more. In short, unless you're above 65 or have special circumstances, you're probably getting more than your fair share. Protein deficiency isn't the problem here, but a surplus probably is. An excess of protein. What happens if you consume too much protein? Let's be clear, there's actually little evidence that too much protein can lead to serious issues you might associate with veiny bodybuilders. For instance, a high protein diet has been linked to compromising kidney function, but only for people with underlying problems, according to Wittard. However, there are real issues with increasing the ratio of protein in your diet, particularly if you're extremely active. For athletes, the main risk associated with increasing protein intake is that this means compromising other macronutrients, Wittard says. If it's at the cost of carbohydrates, this could be counterproductive in a period of intense training. For the rest of us, there's one big risk in eating too much protein: weight gain. Protein, after all, is still calories, and any excess protein you don't use is simply stored as fat. True, eating an excess of protein may not be as bad for you as eating the same amount of carbohydrates. As one meta-review found, protein appears to have a protective effect against weight gain when a person is consuming excess calories, especially when this is combined with weight training. However, the full impact of this effect isn't yet clear. And as Van Loon argues, over-consuming any macronutrient is likely to cause you problems. Overeating, eating more calories than you're burning, increases the chance of developing chronic metabolic diseases, explained Van Loon. This, in turn, greatly increases your risk of obesity. In other words, unlike what the washboard ads displayed on supplement packets suggest, eating more high-protein foods could well lead you to develop more belly fat than muscle. The source matters. So far, so worrying. But obesity may be the least of your woes depending on how you source your protein. While there is no definite link between overall protein intake and risk of death, greater intake of animal protein is associated with a risk of death. And plant protein is associated with a lower risk, says Walter Willett, professor of epidemiology and nutrition at Harvard Chan School of Public Health in the US. As Willett explains, this is largely because of the saturated fat and cholesterol that's found in animal and thus meat cells. Plants, however, contain more unsaturated fats, fiber, and healthy phytochemicals such as flavonoids. This means that going full caveman and ramping up your red meat consumption is likely to greatly increase the risk of cardiovascular disease and reduce your life expectancy, especially if all those sirloin steaks are replacing whole grains and healthy plant oils in your normal diet. But what about the Klitsch-Cavall stereotype of the weedy vegetarian? Surely meat is a better source than plants for building muscle. Although past research suggested animal protein tends to be better digested due to differences in its structure, recent studies have indicated plant-based sources of protein are by no means inferior. Indeed, a review of studies in 2021 concluded there is little difference in terms of muscle strength or lean body mass between animal and plant protein. However, those on a plant-based diet generally have slightly leaner mass without fat. When it comes to building muscles and having an optimal immune response, it ultimately doesn't seem to matter where your protein comes from, Close says. Due to the risk to your overall life expectancy, the best sources of protein, Close argues, are mostly plants, including nuts, beans and other soy foods and whole grains. However, he still recommends getting your protein from a range of foods, including occasional fish, poultry and dairy products. Pro tip: if you're interested in maximizing muscle growth, scientists recommend consuming protein throughout your day across a minimum of meals. However, if you rely solely on plant proteins and want to grow any muscle, there is one catch: you need to make sure your diet contains all the essential amino acids, the amino acids your body can produce on its own. Individual plant proteins are typically deficient in at least one of the 9 essential amino acids, typically lysine or methionine. But importantly, not both. You need them all to build muscle, Wittard says. Lysine is particularly important because it is both a signal and a substrate. Once lysine appears inside the muscle cell, it acts like a traffic light signal and the proteins that control metabolism are switched on. This all means, Wittard says, you need to ensure you're consuming complementary plant-based protein sources to tally up your essential amino acid requirements. For instance, while lentils contain a lot of lysine, they aren't a great source of methionine. Grains such as oats, however, are a good source of methionine. Eat them both in a day and you'll have a complete protein. Other examples of complementary proteins to eat together include pasta with peas, black beans with rice or whole wheat bread with peanut butter. By combining complementary proteins to ensure you have all the amino acids covered, there's no reason plant proteins can't be as useful for muscle health and performance as animal protein, Willett says. And there are some plant proteins with higher levels of lysine than others, including maize, lentils, peas, and quinoa. What about protein supplements? Of course, meat and grains aren't the only sources of protein nowadays. There's also a burgeoning market of bars and powders boasting an impressive amount of muscle fuel on the packet. However, don't be too taken in. I'd much prefer people getting protein from natural sources, Close says. In my industry, we talk about the whole food approach. And where this isn't possible, that's when you can look to a supplement. This isn't just an expert being snobby. Ultimately, the likes of protein bars are often ultra-processed foods which have been associated with an increased risk of obesity due to being dense in calories and sneakily ramping up your appetite. But protein bars and shakes don't need to be totally avoided if they're made from healthy plant sources and not loaded with sugar, Close adds. Sometimes they're convenient, for example, on a long bike ride. And they'd usually be better than a bar or shake made mostly from refined starch and sugar. But again, most people don't need them. From the perspective of a person's whole diet, such products may only make up a small part of their daily protein intake, says Van Loon, and what a person eats throughout the entire day is much more important. However, there are other ways to improve diet besides only taking protein supplements. You should only supplement on top of a good diet, he says. Overall, the occasional protein shake won't do you much harm. Do it every day, however, and you might have a problem. You'll be left consuming a horde of unneeded calories with your bank balance slimming a lot faster than your waistline. So relax. Although the health industry wants you to think you have a serious diet deficiency, one that can only be solved by purchasing several expensive barrels of powder, your protein intake is nothing to worry about.